Hello everyone and welcome to our second lecture on violent crimes. In today's lecture, we will be covering three specific types of violent crimes, which are multiple murders, school violence, and workplace violence. Before we look into each of these different types of violent crimes, we will first look at what investigative psychology is all about. Investigative psychology is a term given to a new area of applied psychology that was developed by Dr. David Kenter, the director for the Center for Investigative Psychology at the University of Liverpool. This new field attempts to describe the actions of offenders and to develop a better understanding of crime. It is hoped that this enhanced understanding of crime can not just help to solve crimes, but also contribute to prosecution and defense procedures. It is seen as a framework for the integration of a diverse range of aspects of psychology into all areas of criminal and civil investigation. It is basically concerned with all forms of criminality that may be examined by the police, and this may range from arson and burglary to murder, rape, and even terrorism. Within the context of investigative psychology, it is advised that we don't use the word profiling because of a few reasons. Firstly, the activity of profiling is unregulated. That is, there is no body that oversees the so-called profilers, and so anyone can claim to be a profiler even though they may not have the necessary qualifications, experience, or skills. Secondly, profilers usually act based on hunches, which means that their methods of investigation may not be scientific in nature and therefore leaves a lot of room for error. Thirdly, it is thought that many profilers have self-serving motives. For example, they want the fame or the acknowledgement of helping to solve a crime. And finally, the term profilers itself is over-sensationalized as it is often portrayed in the movies, on TV, as somebody who has almost magical powers in helping to solve crimes. Investigative psychology attempts to address this issue in a more scientific manner by answering three fundamental questions. Firstly, what are the important behavioral features of the crime that may help identify and successfully prosecute the perpetrator? For example, did the perpetrator leave behind any evidence that could let us know who she or he is? The evidence could be things like fingerprints, to hair samples, to DNA samples, or it may also be a certain pattern of behavior or a certain keepsake that the person leaves behind, for example, a rose or a smiley face. Secondly, what inferences can we make about the characteristics of the offender that may help identify him or her? This is usually observable through patterns that may be observed in a series of crime. And thirdly, are there any other crimes that are likely to have been committed by the same person? If there are, indicating these related crimes could also help solve the particular crime that they're focusing on and identify the perpetrator. Now, in the textbook and in some areas of criminal psychology, the term profiling is still used. And profiling in this sense is aimed at gathering information about a person or persons who may have committed the crime. There are 5 overlapping categories of profiling, which we will look at subsequent slides. And it is important to note that these different categories are not although these different categories use different methods, they can also be used together to solve a particular crime. And these categories could be clinical in nature. For example, they could be qualitative and focus on a specific case, or they could be actuarial or quantitative in nature, where information from groups of offenders who have committed similar crimes are collated and analyzed to help predict patterns. The first category of profiling that we will look at is crime scene profiling, which is also known as criminal or offender profiling. It was first developed by the Behavioral Sciences Unit of the FBI in the United States. Basically, crime scene profiling is based on the technique of personalization, where the history of crime scene profiling can be traced back to as early as Jack the Ripper. You would have probably heard of him. He's one of the most famous serial killers, and the case was never solved, in which we don't know who Jack the Ripper actually was. But during that time, the chief forensic pathologist who was in charge of the investigation inferred personality characteristics of who this elusive Jack the Ripper could possibly be, based on the nature of the wounds inflicted on victims. Crime scene profiling is basically the process of identifying specific personality traits, behavioral patterns, even geographic habits, as in where the perpetrator may like to hang out or may live or may work, cognitive tendencies or thought patterns, as well as demographic features such as is he likely to be male or female, how heavy, how tall, ethnicity, and so on. As mentioned earlier, it focuses on traits of features and habits of the unknown offender based on crime characteristics. To actually conduct crime scene profiling, the investigator usually goes through the items left behind at the crime scene, body position that the victim was left in, as well as the patterns of mutilation. It is thought that this evidence that's left behind will help us better understand the cognitive processes of the offender. One important concept in crime scene profiling is the idea of staging. That is, that sometimes the perpetrator or someone else may intentionally alter the crime scene before the police arrives. This may be done for one of two reasons. Firstly, to redirect investigation away from the most logical suspect by planting false evidence, for example, or secondly, to protect the victim or the victim's family. Another aspect of crime scene profiling that is usually investigated is the concept of undoing, where the offender tries to psychologically undo the murder, as in if the victim was undressed or not wearing any clothes or naked, the offender may dress the victim again. The offender may place the victim in a comfortable position instead of an uncomfortable position even after they're dead. And this usually happens when the offender gets very upset about the death or has a close association with the victim. One way that crime scene is by determining whether the murder was best categorized as an organized or a disorganized murder. This slide and the following slide actually shows the different characteristics that offenders who are involved in either type of murder are thought to have. I'm not going to go into these different characteristics because they're quite self-explanatory, but what I would like to define here is the difference between an organized crime scene, a disorganized crime scene, and a mixed crime scene. An organized crime scene is usually a crime scene which indicates or shows evidence of planning and premeditation. It also suggests that the offender maintained control of himself or his or her victim. A disorganized crime scene, on the other hand, demonstrates that the offender was very likely to have committed the crime without much planning or premeditated thought. The offender in these cases usually acts based on impulse, rage, or sudden excitement. They don't usually plan to ambush the victim at that point, but instead they usually meet the victim by chance and may not even have a specific type of victim in mind. The third category of crime scene is a combination of the two and is called the mixed crime scene, and it usually has ingredients of both. For example, the crime may have begun as one that was carefully planned, but along the way something didn't go as planned, and so it evolved into a disorganized crime scene. Mixed crime scenes are actually the most common type of crime scene. This slide here actually focuses on the characteristics of an organized or disorganized murderer based on their personality traits, their demographic factors, and their background. Following slide, which is this slide here, on the other hand, focuses on the nature of the crime, what may have occurred during the crime itself, as well as how the victim was treated and what was done with the victim and evidence after the crime was completed. A second category of profiling that we will look at, and this is also known as behavioral profiling. It is a method widely used by criminal investigators to develop profiles for murders, rapists, and other violent criminals who have yet to be apprehended. Most psychological profilers within the context of the United States anyway are FBI special agents, as it requires a lot of training and a lot of practice. What then is psychological profiling? Basically, it is defined as an assessment practice that is designed to help the identification and prediction of specific behaviors in individuals. It can be used to predict both positive or negative characteristics of a perpetrator. It involves two steps. Firstly, threat assessment, where a psychological profiler may go through a specific process to determine the validity and the seriousness of the threat made by the person. Usually, the threat has already been made and is directed towards a person, facility, institution, and organization. The psychological profiler then will assess the validity and the seriousness of the threat and then decide on what actions need to, or then recommend actions that need to be taken. Psychological profiling may also involve risk assessment, which is the process of evaluating individuals who have violated social norms or displayed bizarre behaviors. In such cases, usually the threat hasn't been made, and what the profiler is hoping to do is to estimate the probability that the person is likely to harm himself or others and how to prevent it. Therefore, risk assessment is usually made based on information received from people around somebody who may be a perpetrator. Geographical profiling, on the other hand, is a criminal investigative methodology that analyzes the locations of a connected series of crimes to determine the most probable area that the offender resides or works in. It is a technique that is used to locate where a serial offender stays or other locations that act as their base. For example, research has suggested that an offender usually offends close to home or work, or on the way between home, on the route between home or work, but usually not too close to home or work. Where the crimes often occur may also give us an idea of where the offender stays, or where he works, or where he usually hangs out. This may give investigators a better idea of where to start looking for the offender, or radius of area within which they could look for an offender. In recent times, more and more sophisticated computer software has actually been developed to help with this type of analysis. The fourth category that we will look at is suspect-based profiling, which is also known as prospective profiling. It is known as prospective profiling because in such cases, an offense has not yet been committed. Instead, suspect-based profiling is used to help identify psychological and behavioral features of a person who may commit a particular type of crime. It is particularly useful for identifying possible offenders for specific types of crimes such as stalking, terrorism, and even shoplifting. In today's context, it is something that's usually used widely at airports and border crossings, where immigration or customs officials may use some form of suspect-based profiling to decide on who to stop for further checks or interrogation. One of the main disadvantages of suspect-based profiling is that it could lead to racial profiling. And racial profiling has consistently been one of the most confounding, divisive, and controversial issues. It has led to the perception that authorities may target specific ethnic or racial groups, and this has created a lot of dissatisfaction within the society. True racial profiling, in which people are targeted solely because of their race or ethnicity, is illegal and immoral. However, suspect-based profiling isn't just, or when done correctly, suspect-based profiling isn't based on racial profiling, but is based on other characteristics or sound proof to suggest that a particular category or particular type of person is at highest risk for committing a crime. Finally, the last category is a type of profiling known as equivocal depth analysis profiling, and which is also known as EDA. EDA is also known as reconstructive psychological evaluation, and is basically the process of reconstructing the emotional life, behavioral patterns, and cognitive features of a deceased person. In some sense, it is like a post-mortem psychological analysis, which is why it is also sometimes referred to as a psychological autopsy. Initially, it was used to help officials determine the cause of deaths that were classified as ambiguous or uncertain, and it is usually utilized in solving single murders. It involves the discovery and reconstruction of the deceased person's life based on evidence left behind. As it's still a relatively new technique, the reliability and validity of EDA profiling is still very much questionable. Now that we have covered the different types of profiling, we will look at 3 different categories of violent crimes, starting with multiple murders. Before we start examining multiple murders, who are likely perpetrators and what it actually is about, I'd first like to point out that there are actually 3 main categories of multiple murders. The first is the serial murder, and serial murders are defined as incidents where 2 or more victims are killed in separate events. The duration or the time frame between each event is known as the cooling period, and it could be days, months, and sometimes even years. The connecting factor between the 2 events is that the crimes were committed by the same person. Spree murders, on the other hand, is what we call crimes where 3 or more people were killed without a cooling period, as in the sense that they may have been killed consecutively one after another. And the third category is the mass murder, where 4 or more people are killed in a single location, usually one after another, which is why there is no cooling off period. Perpetrators in this case differ from the serial murderer or the spree murderer because they could be acting individually or within a group context. Mass murders can be further divided into 2 other categories. Plastic mass murder, where the individual, for example, may barricade himself or herself inside a building and randomly kill members of the public. Family mass murders, on the other hand, is what we term crimes where 3 or more family members are killed. Very often, the perpetrator kills himself after killing his or her family members. When looking at serial murders, it is often difficult to estimate the exact number of victims of a particular perpetrator. This usually happens for 2 reasons. Firstly, the murderers are very often good at hiding bodies. Sometimes they may even dispose of the body in parts, so it is more difficult to identify the victims. Secondly, they often select victims who are not easily missed. They may be homeless people who have no social connections or little social connections with others, or they may be prostitutes who are often not missed for a long time, or even when missed are probably not likely to be reported missing by their friends due to the nature of their work. Serial murderers also often target strangers, that is, they don't target their family and friends. As they kill strangers who have no consensual relationship between the offender, between them and the victim, it makes it harder to identify the killer because the killer could be any random person who is not associated with the victims. Serial murderers usually prefer hands-on killing methods where they don't usually use weapons, but instead they prefer to use their hands. Common methods of killing include strangulation and beating with their hands or feet. Beating with their hands or kicking with their feet. Usually such murders are carefully planned and thought through, which also contributes to the fact that it makes it hard to estimate the number of victims or identify the serial murderer. Usually there is no one single identifiable factor that can help us understand why these serial murders were committed. And the motivations differ across serial murderers. These motivations may be a combination of psychological rewards, such as an ego boost or feeling in control of another person or self-esteem. It could also be because they want the media attention that is generated from their act, such as the happy face killer. This is someone that we will look at in more detail later. They may also commit the crimes for sexual excitement or for material gain. They're not motivated by compulsion. That is, they are usually well thought through and planned, and most serial murderers are not mentally disturbed, or neither do they have a psychological disorder. In fact, many have very strong emotional ties within the society and family. Some are even thought to be respected members of the community. Others, however, may have had a troubled background in the sense they may have been abused or neglected as children. And usually, serial murderers don't start their life of crime earlier. They only start their crimes at about 24 to 40 years old. And this also contributes to the fact that it's harder to identify them as they do not have a past criminal record. On this slide, I show you two examples of serial murderers who crave publicity. The first person is Keith Hunter Jesperson, and the second, Dennis Rader. Keith Hunter Jesperson was a Canadian-American serial killer who murdered at least 8 women in the United States in the early 1990s. He was also known as the Happy Face Killer because he drew smiley faces on many of his letters that he addressed to the media and prosecutors. He usually picked victims who were prostitutes and transients who had no connections with him and who were also not likely to be reported as missing. Like many serial murderers, strangulation was his preferred method. And later on it was found out that strangulation was the same method that he often used to kill animals even as a young child. After the body of his first victim was found, media attention surrounded another person, a Laverne Pavlinak, a woman who falsely confessed to having killed the victim. Jesperson was upset that the media attention was going to somebody else and not to him. And so what he did is he drew a smiley face on a bathroom wall miles away from the scene of the crime, on which he anonymously confessed to killing his first victim. When that didn't elicit a response, he began writing letters directly to the media and prosecutors, providing details of the crime, where it occurred, and how it occurred, to add legitimacy to his claim of being the murderer. He had claimed to have killed as many as 160 people, although only 8 murders have been confirmed. The last confirmed victim was his longtime girlfriend, and this is what eventually led to his capture because she obviously had a personal connection with him, and it was easier to associate him with her. The second person is Dennis Lynn Rader, another serial killer who operated in America, and he murdered 10 people over a longer period of time, almost 17 years, that is between 1974 and 1991. He's also known as the BTK killer or BTK strangler, where BTK stands for bind, torture, and kill, which was his infamous signature and also his modus operandi. He also sent letters describing the details of the killings or his murders to the police and local news outlets during the interval when the murders happened. Eventually, the letters that he sent led to his arrest in 2005 and he pleaded guilty. He's currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences in prison. In terms of the victims who are likely to be targeted by serial killers, geographical location is often one clue. For example, serial killers usually have a preferred location or area which is usually close to their own comfort zone. The comfort zones in this case are defined by an anchor point related to them, which could be where they work, where they live, or where they have family members. Few serial murderers actually travel interstate to kill, unless they are required to work or to move from place to place for work. For example, long-distance truck drivers. There are also certain similarities in terms of ethnicity or race. For example, in the US, many people assume that African Americans are more likely to be victims and Caucasian Americans more likely to be perpetrators. However, statistics have proven that this is not true, as minority groups are also equally likely to be a serial killer. One reason for this false belief is actually the disparity in media coverage, either in terms of the actual news or what we see in the movies and on TV. Juvenile series or juvenile serial killers are rare, but when they do act or when they are around, they usually have the same psychological profile as adult serial killers. Next, we will look at examples. Now, if you remember from my earlier slide, a spree killer or a spree murderer is somebody who has killed 3 or more people with no cooling off period in between them. And this is basically what makes them differ from a serial killer who has a cooling off period between each crime. One spree killer that was featured a lot in the media recently was Christopher Jordan Donner. He was 33 years old and was a disgruntled former Los Angeles Police Department officer who felt that he was treated unfairly by the LAPD and was dismissed unfairly. He felt that he had a need to avenge his dismissal, and he chose to do so through targeted killings and random bloodshed. Prior to his act of spree killing, he didn't actually have anything suspicious about his past, and his spree killings actually started with him murdering a basketball coach and her fiancé. And he chose these 2 victims because the basketball coach was the daughter of someone he perceived to be his enemy, that is somebody who was part of his perceived unfair dismissal from the police force. He then also shot 3 other policemen and killing one in the midst of a massive manhunt. He was able to get away for a long time and to do what he did because he was a Navy-trained shooter and an expert marksman. He also had multiple weapons with him, including assault rifles. And a $1 million reward was put up for anyone who would help with his capture. Eventually, he was shot by the police, but he explained why he was doing what he did through an 11-page manifesto that he had written before he went on the killing spree. He made this manifesto public by posting it on his Facebook page, and in As part of this manifesto, he threatened him for destroying his career. As part of his manifesto, he had also written that I will utilize every bit of small arms training, demolition ordnance, and survival training that I've had to get back on the people who falsely accused me. Another spree killer who was much younger is actually teenage Elliot Roger, who was the son of the Hunger Games director. He was much younger, he was only a teenager, but he has had a troubled past where not only was he shy, angry, and sexually frustrated, but he had also been undergoing therapy since he was 9 years old. He started his spree killings because he wanted to take revenge against the girls that had rejected him and the boys that the girls chose to go out with instead. He had published what he had planned to do through his YouTube channel, and the link is here. And the police had actually previously gone to raid his house, but they were not able to continue with the raid because they didn't have the proper paperwork to do so. They had actually continued with the search of his house. They would have been able to see the weapons that he had, and this would have probably saved the lives of many people. The third category that we'll be looking at is mass murders, and although it is a topic that many of us may be interested in, little research has actually been directed as mass murders, as more research has been directed as serial murders, because I suppose it's easier to get media attention on them. But basically, the profile of a classic mass murder is summarized on this slide. They're usually people who are frustrated and angry. They may be older, between 35 and 45 years old. They may perceive themselves to be failures, at least by their own standards. They often suffer a big loss in their lives and feel hopeless. They feel like they are unable to carry on and improve on their lives. They are also usually socially isolated, which means they don't really have a social support system and have no social network they can turn to. They have a very strong interest in guns and weapons, and they very usually plan to die at the scene after killing their chosen targets. Mass murders are usually carefully planned, and their targets are deliberately chosen. Their victims are chosen because they are symbols for their discontent. For example, somebody may choose victims at his ex-workplace if he feels like he has been dismissed unfairly, or the victims may be symbolic of the people that they hate or blame for their own misfortunes. Fox and Levin in 2003 proposed the 5-category typology of mass murderers based on their motivations. In the first category, they say mass murderers may be motivated by revenge. That is, they may be motivated by the need to get even with a group of people. And victims are chosen because they are associated with a primary target against whom revenge is sought. An example would be Michael McLendon, who was 28 years old, who was involved or responsible for a rampage in southern Alabama that killed 11 people, ending with himself. He targeted a list of people that he felt had done him wrong in his life, and this started with his mum and her 4 dogs. He killed them by burning their house down, and ended with workers at a sausage plant that he used to work in. A second motivating factor may be power, where the mass murderer may crave the fear in others and the control that they have over this group of people, at least for that specific time frame. It is also usually associated with revenge. And in the cases where power is a big motivating factor, usually the perpetrator is dressed in a military uniform or in combat gear and will carry assault weapons that may enhance his feelings of power. Such crimes are usually linked to hate crimes, as they are targeted towards a group of people the perpetrator really dislikes. A third category is love, where the perpetrator feels like they have to do what they're doing to save their loved one from misery or a life of hardship. These acts are usually committed based on a sense of misplaced loyalty and usually involve family massacres. An example of a typical mass murder motivated by love would be a husband or father who is upset about the fate of his family unit, and so he decides to take his own life and that of his family to protect them from further suffering. Some mass murderers are also motivated by profit, where they want to send a message to potential witnesses or to eliminate witnesses to a crime. The message they may want to send to potential witnesses is, don't speak up, this could happen to you as well. And usually this is the case when it involves drug lords or gang rivalry. Finally, mass murders may be motivated by the need to instill terror in a certain group, where the mass murderer wants to send a message through a horrific murder. One example of such a crime is what was committed by Charles Manson. He strongly believed that the African Americans would kill all the Caucasian Americans except him or his family. And so he told 4 of his followers it was time for what he termed as helter-skelter. He asked them to commit brutal mass murders and leave a sign to ignite fear and terror. Some of the victims actually had the words pig and war carved on their abdomens. And his purpose was actually so fierce so people would take his message a little bit more seriously. One of the more famous multiple murders that involved families in recent times was the Nepalese royal family massacre in 2001. It actually occurred within the grounds of the palace then, where Prince Dipendra killed 10 members of his family during a party or part of their monthly reunion dinner of the royal family in their house or their palace. The dead at that time included his father and his mother, the King and Queen of Nepal. The widely circulated rumor is that Prince Dipendra was very angry over a marriage dispute. His choice of bride, Devyani Rana, was not looked upon favorably by the royal family, and so he was angry and he was depressed. Although he was known to be intelligent and charming and well-liked, he also had a darker side to him where he was obsessed with weapons. He liked shooting around the palace grounds, and he was also known to be dependent on antidepressants and also abused substances such as alcohol and hashish on a fairly regular basis. In this next section, we will look at school violence. School violence can be divided into 4 main areas. Shootings, where there is use of weapons and many people are usually killed. Assault, which could either be simple assault or aggravated assault. Sexual assault and robbery. One of the most famous cases of school shootings is the Columbine shooting. To find out more about the Columbine shooting, you can actually watch this video by clicking on the link on the slide. Another case of school violence is actually a kid Kinkle, who was an expelled high school student. He started his trail that ended in school violence by first murdering 2 parents before engaging in a shooting at his high school. This shooting left 2 students dead and 25 others wounded. What actually triggered his act was when he was suspended, pending an expulsion, for being in possession of a loaded, stolen handgun that was found in his locker in school. He had actually purchased the handgun from a friend who had stolen the handgun from his father, as in from the friend's father. He admitted to having the handgun in his locker when questioned, and he was then suspended pending an expulsion. At home, he was told by his father that he would be sent to military school if he didn't change his behavior. And according to Kip Kinkle's own taped confession, at about 3 p.m., when his father was seated at the kitchen drinking coffee, he retrieved his rifle from his bedroom and ammunition from his parents' bedroom. He then went to the kitchen, shot his father once in the back of the head. He then dragged his father's body in the bathroom and covered it with a sheet. When his mother arrived home at 6:30 p.m., he told her that he loved her and then shot her twice, in the back of the head, 3 times in her face, and once in the heart. He then dragged her body across the floor and also covered it with a sheet. From there, he went on to school, and that's when he started his shooting spree in school. In a note that he left on a coffee table in the living room, he described his motives for killing his parents as out of love. He says, "I just got 2 felonies on my record. My parents can't take that. It would destroy them. The embarrassment would be too much for them. They couldn't live with themselves." As the note continues, he attempts to describe his mental state. He says, my head just doesn't buy. I hear voices to tell me that I have to kill people. I have no choice. I don't know why. His attorneys tried to argue for the insanity plea. However, it was rejected, and he's currently serving a 111-year sentence without the possibility of parole. Kip Kinkle, many school shooters have common characteristics where they face peer rejection and social rejection from a very young age. As a result, they have little or no social support and nobody that they can turn to. They also don't really have pro-social relationships either with their peers or family members who may be a positive influence on them. Like the Columbine killers, they usually have a very strong and unusual interest in guns, firearms, and other weapons, and they're able to access it. Like Kip Kinkle and the Columbine killers, many also make their violent intentions clear to others beforehand, either through videos or stories or by speaking to people. Unfortunately, however, very often their intentions are dismissed or not taken seriously enough. If they were, many of these incidences may have been avoidable. Um, in, in addition to those common characteristics, school shooters also often share some psychological characteristics. A typical school shooter is usually a male student who has been ostracized by the majority of the group at school for some time. As a result of the social rejection, or probably because he's been subjected to bullying, teasing, and romantic rejection at times for a long time, he may feel a sense of social rejection. He or she, well usually he, usually also is often publicly humiliated by others. In addition to the social rejection, a school shooter also may also have one or more of the following risk factors. Firstly, she or he, most of the times it's a he, has psychological problems, which may include things like depression, lack of impulse control, lack of empathy, and may also display antisocial behaviors from a young age. As mentioned earlier, the school shooter is also likely to have a strong interest in guns and explosives and have access to a collection of weapons. Finally, school shooters usually also have a strong fascination with death, specifically deaths which are very macabre in nature and are associated with sadistic themes, and killing people with a lot of bloodshed or violence. Another form of school violence that is much less severe is school bullying, and this is a common significant problem for children across the world. School Bullying often involves peer aggression and victimization, where intentional harm doing is carried out repeatedly over time. It occurs within an interpersonal relationship characterized by a power imbalance, where the bully often has a lot more power over the victim. And school bullying is something that, although it is not severe or intense, it can actually lead to very severe consequences if it is not addressed. For example, we know that many school shooters were actually victims of school bullying from a young age. Um, in the short run, school bullying has no direct effect on fluency, but it is likely to occur if the bullied student is not engaged or his or her needs are not addressed. Often school bullying or the effects of school bullying is worse when a student changes school. For example, when there is a change in structure from elementary or primary school to middle school. We know that it's important for victims of school bullying to have support from adults so they know that there is somebody that they can trust and turn to. And recent research suggests that schools can actually preempt bullying by teaching students to care for each other and by inculcating other protective factors in both the bully and the victim. The final category that we will be looking at is workplace violence. And workplace violence can be divided into two main categories. First, workplace violence, we can define as incidents that intends to cause serious physical or bodily harm to an individual within an organization, or where the offender intends to cause serious harm to the organization itself. Workplace aggression, on the other hand, is less severe and more general. It is defined as all forms of behavior where individuals attempt to harm others at work or intend to harm their organization. We know that there are some areas of work where workplace violence is higher than others, and these include work that involves law enforcement, work that involves security guards or bartenders. It's not surprising that workplace violence is actually highest in these type of work environment because they are by nature more protective and the people who work there are more likely to be exposed to violence in the first place. When looking at workplace violence, there are four main type 1 of offenders don't actually have and the intention is not actually to harm anybody there, but the intention is often linked to robbery or theft. And violence is a byproduct of their goal of committing robbery or theft. Often, this kind of workplace violence may end in homicide because even though it was not planned to be so in the beginning. Type 2 workplace violence or type 2 workplace violent offenders are usually offenders who are recipients of service provided by the workplace who are not happy with the service provided. They could be former clients of a lawyer, former patients of a doctor, or former customers who are disgruntled by the services that they receive and they blame the provider of the services for their misfortune. Type 3 offenders, on the other hand, are current or former employees who has a dispute with another employee and feels that he or she has been treated unfairly. The target in these cases are usually somebody in a position of authority. Finally, type 4 offenders are offenders who don't actually have a direct involvement with the workplace, but instead are indirectly involved with the work environment through their relationship with another employee. One example of this could be an ex-lover who is disgruntled, who turns up at his ex-girlfriend's workplace and beats her up there because he feels she treated him wrongly. There are some signs that we can actually look out for. Co-workers who may be more likely to be violent. Some of these signs are actually summarized on the slide. I won't go through them in detail because they're quite self-explanatory. Now this brings us to the end of today's lecture. If you have any questions, please approach me or your tutor. Thank you.